Hey,
This is
good to
Ian
see you at last.
Glendinning, and we've talked before on Karen's channel, and we
Hmm.
talk, we communicate via social media, and Ian is one of the original MOQ, part of the MOQ group from 10, 15 years ago now, or maybe even more. And Ian, could you briefly tell us a little
Yeah,
bit about yourself and your involvement in this in
yeah,
Persic's work?
yeah. So we'll come on to the more Pirsig specific stuff, and obviously I was involved with the
Mhm.
MOQ discuss and MOQ forum, but actually I was quite a latecomer to that, and there are much more important players in that which we can talk about. But I'll just come back to how I got involved here. So, long story short, I'm an engineer, so went off to university to do engineering and went into engineering. So in fact, I wasn't really a reader of fiction or any kind of literature really. I was a sort of techie geek really, and was quite happy being that for more than 20 years in industry after having become an engineer. Um, but apart from I had a few nagging doubts in in the early days, which I only really recognised later on about information that we were capturing and sharing about the jobs that we were doing they always were presented objectively, but I always had this sneaking suspicion they weren't as objective as they appeared to be. And in fact, that really came to a head when, in the sort of 90s and into the early noughties, I was very much involved in um, modeling business systems. So actually, how businesses worked and how that got implemented in actual software technology, but basically how business worked and how the particular businesses that I was in worked. And gone into a huge amount of very generic information modeling, like how do you represent something as complicated as a business full of people in an information model. And that's when it kind of threw up to me that there was more to this than just the apparent facts that were documented as part of the engineering. There's a huge amount of psychological stuff about how people behaved and so on. I was lucky that I actually did a master's, did an MBA at that point as well. So I did a bit of management background training there as well. Um, and I carried on that position where this was probably just a nagging down, but never really saw it as a big thing. I wasn't into philosophy in those days. I was just an engineer doing my job, but I could never really articulate what the problem was. And I guess the thing that, I mean, I quite freely admitted, the thing that actually kick-started me was actually 9/11. It was the fact that there's something seriously going wrong here. Um, and it was also about the time when people started blogging. So people started doing things online post 9/11, which they hadn't done beforehand. So I was just part of that sort of movement of just investigating stuff through online means and started. That's when my blog started.
Did you start Cybertron at that time, or did you call it that, or was it something
Yeah,
else?
I call it Cybertron right from the off. With hindsight, that was actually quite a clever move. I think it actually really encapsulates what it's about. But it was very straightforward at the time. Um, yeah, so it was immediately post 9/11. I started then. I still haven't read Pirsig. I'd missed two opportunities to read him already by then. One, obviously, as a teenager in 1974, and again, actually, as part of the management training course, it was actually on a reading list, and I never read it. Um, and it's when those nagging doubts turned into this is something of global significance we have to fix. That was 9/11 that gave me that kick in the pants. Um, and I started blogging just as a means that it was a bit like, sort of, it makes sense in English, tennis elbow foot. Basically, it was just a curiosity driven exercise. I had these thoughts and I had all this information available. It was just joining up dots and connections between stuff. So it was very disorganized and not particularly philosophical to start with. Um, and in fact, it was the work of actually a Nobel Prize physicist called Brian Josephson, who actually referenced something about Eastern thought being somehow possibly more fundamental than the physics that he was doing. And he was actually a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and that just hit me. And I thought, what was the name of that book again that I'd never read? You know, that had Zen the title, but was about motorbikes.
Uh,
And that's kind of when it started. So that was about 2002, I think I first read it. And so that was the first release that, yes, there is something about not just the technical modeling in terms of objective entities and properties in a sort of scientific engineering STEM kind of sense, but there was a way of looking at the world that recognized other things that weren't captured by that. And since then, that research has become progressively full-time to the point that now I'm actually effectively retired and just writing, using the research that I've done to write. So first thing was, it wasn't reading Pirsig that first put me onto the topic, but it was somebody else just referring to the topic that said, I must read Pirsig. So it had a huge effect, and I went on to read Lila immediately after ZMM.
And so then 3 years later, you presented a paper at the meeting.
That's right. So very shortly after that, I investigated Pirsig, that's right, and I discovered that this community existed. So I joined that community, the MOQ.org community.
So what was that like in those early days when Pirsig was still
alive? In a way, that was pretty mid-period, because, of course, it had actually kicked off fairly shortly after 1991. So early to mid-90s, it had actually kicked off with the guys that were actually reading Lila and trying to take the actual metaphysical content more seriously than just the literary content in the original book and the thoughts, but treating it actually as a metaphysics. All of this meant nothing to me then. I was naive when it came to philosophy. Yeah, so I joined that, but having got quite into it, because I was actually actively researching it, I got quite heavily involved because I was very interested in it. It wasn't just sort of incidental. It became quite a strong focal point for my research. So yeah, I participated in a big way when Ant organised that conference.
And let's discuss who Ant is for our audience.
Yeah, so again, I didn't know Ant before this. So Dr. Ant McWatt was the first person to actually get a PhD, which was specifically about Pirsig's work. There are a number of people who've brought him into their American pragmatism and other sort of bits of work, but he actually had quite a lot of help from Pirsig doing it.
No.
You know, a lot of correspondence asking questions about what he'd written, so he could actually update his own work.
Yes, and one of your links is to that correspondence.
Absolutely, yeah. We can come to that. Yes, there's a side issue, but yeah, there's a massive stuff here which I've collected just as I came across it. So if you look at my Pirsig pages, it's actually a bit of a mess. It's just a huge pile of stuff just in chronological order from when I first came across it. And what we're doing with the Robert Pirsig Association just now, we'll say a bit more about, is just to try and create a better resource for any other researcher to find all the content that they can. But lots of stuff exists.
Yeah, but it's really nice that you've put it all in one place, even if it's organized as you'd like it.
Yeah, but obviously the guy running MOQ.org, Mick White, commonly known as Horse, and Ant himself had someone set up a web page. So between us, we had a huge amount of stuff, and of course Henry Gurr in the States as well. Yes. So 4 very large sites with lots of content. Ant's was probably the most organized, but unfortunately he let his content lapse. He just didn't realize he needed to keep paying someone to keep his website up and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, long story. But it all exists, so we at least marshal it all in one place. So having set up the Robert Pirsig Association, we can at least now marshal it into one consistent set. So that was meant to be a side issue. So yes, so I'd been interacting with these people and suggested I come to the conference. Was actually harder than it seemed, because I was actually working in China at the time, would you believe, and the conference was in Liverpool, but that's another story. But I did, and again, because I was fairly new compared to most of those guys who'd been doing this for about 10 years at that point, and only been there 2 or 3 years, I helped because I was obviously in the UK. I knew the arrangements, despite having to come back from China. But yeah, so I helped with some of the introductory presentations and some of the remote ones. So Henry Gurr had one which I delivered on his behalf, and a couple of us set up a sort of introduction to Pirsig to start with. In the main body of the conference, I simply presented my thought journey as a story, really, because I was not in a position to have a thesis of my own or a particular set of conclusions. So I just said, well, this is what I've been thinking so far. It turns out to have been, despite the fact I would probably update a lot of the content in detail, the actual trajectory of how my thought went is still pretty well reflected in that paper, which is a source of embarrassment to me, because in fact, I think I discovered most of what I needed to know, what is now 20 years ago almost, 2024 now. And I still haven't written anything that reflects the actual sum total of it. I'm still blogging. We'll come back to blogging in the creative process as well, if you don't mind. But, so yeah, so where are we? Yeah, so that was 2005. That was the conference. I don't know how much you know about the conference, but
I don't know enough. I'd really like to hear about it from someone who was there and who's someone who met Pirsig. So if you can give your impressions, so we can kind of revisit.
Yeah, so about 8 or 10 people delivered significant papers, and McWatt's website has all of that listed. And they were mostly people who've been active on MLQ discussed before. The big downside of that conference is someone tried one of these SoCal papers to actually sort of try and undermine the topic of the conference. And it created a lot of bad blood. Mm-hmm. So there was so although the actual event went okay, the immediate fallout was actually very painful for some people. Mm-hmm. You just leave it at that. But I was fairly phlegmatic about it. Thought, well, you learn something from this, and it was just added to the pile of resources we needed to analyze.
Well, one of the big upsides of that conference, though, is Pirsig actually attended.
Yes, so Pirsig attended, and in fact, Anthony had arranged for a BBC production team to interview him as well. So, as well as the conference, I think it was almost like a whole day before the conference of Pirsig being interviewed by these people on a range of subjects. And then they carried on filming the actual conference. As you pointed out, Pirsig was already some age by then, so he was actually quite tired. It did actually wear him out a bit, and he didn't come to all evening events because he was just too tired, having done all of the high-pressure stuff during the day. But it was interesting to meet him. I didn't actually spend a lot of time talking to him there, except on one of the social events.
But you talked to him some. Can you kind of tell us about those conversations?
Probably mixing up conversations now, but well, actually, in a way, I didn't get a lot from him other than he was. The main thing I think I noticed was in him was he was like the proud father of a new baby. He was just relieved to see people taking his stuff seriously, and he was more sort of laid back about the content, wasn't needing to push anything. I think he was just happy to see that, look, there's these people actually taking my work seriously, a wish for it going forward and all that. That was mainly the sort of stuff I picked up from him.
Well, he was very positively engaged in Lila's Child and in Ant McWatt's dissertation.
Yes, and that was all before the conference. Yes, that had all happened. Ant's dissertation obviously happened by then. Right. That was his PhD awarding ceremony.
But he wasn't encouraging of the whole thing. He seemed very happy that people were taking it seriously, and he didn't seem, like to nitpick or be resentful or critical. He seemed to be
yes, that's right. It was a bit of a celebratory kind of conference than a sort of technically deep critical conference. Absolutely, and that was actually what eventually caused part of the bad feeling when people took advantage of that. But it's history now. But,
yeah.
Obviously, for people like Ant, it probably much more hurtful on him personally. But
well, it was supposed to be about his dissertation to a large degree, wasn't it?
Yeah. And in fact, Ant didn't present a lot because he had presented his stuff earlier to the MOQ group, and he was more or less really just the custodian of the event. It wasn't his event in terms of content. Yeah. Yeah. So I came away, obviously, now having met Bob and his wife Wendy, but lots of the other people that I called MOQers, the people that were just been online. And in those days, of course, it was all just email discussion forums. We've very rarely seen each other's faces in it before. So it was meeting a lot of people that were just names on emails at that point. So that was very useful for future conversations when you wanted to clarify things you were thinking about. Yeah.
And even to this day, now that these new events are happening, some of these names are still involved.
Yeah, lots of them still are. Not all is still involved the same way they were. Some people have kind of mellowed and are just going on. It's just part of what's happened in their life. It's not necessarily a big thing in their current life.
Well, without Pirsig being alive, and also it was so close to the publication date of Lila.
Yes. I guess it was. It was only 6 years. Yeah. So back to me then, I guess. So obviously I picked up a lot of contacts and got a lot more enthusiasm about the content that I'd already got into. So I've carried on researching ever since. And I have said before that around, by the time I got to about, so that's 2005, by the time I got to about 2010, I've reading both books and reading the, Ant's dissertation and various other papers that people produced, I got to the point where I thought I'd kind of extracted what I wanted from it. So I did in fact declare, I think I'm finished with Pirsig now. Everything I needed, I've got, and I'm going off to do my own projects and write about it.
Say I've got everything I need. I need that you have. That means it's sort of a lens and a filter now for as you move forward, correct?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, absolutely. So obviously by then I was researching lots of other writers. I mean, in science and in philosophy and in fact, Russian classic literature also, and my reading just became enormous at that point.
Can I add something there that I read in your work is that, you said you didn't read literature before, and then after post literature, post Pirsig, a lot of literature.
Yeah, I was like a born again reader. Well, as you can see, I just, I have so much reading these on so many different subjects, because what you discover very quickly once you're talking about a metaphysics, frankly, everything in the world is connected to it somewhere. So it's almost impossible not to. So in fact, finding connections and patterns, that's probably kind of the way my brain works, I think. So as an engineer and a modeler, that's kind of what's driven it. So I found lots of patterns that really consolidated into what almost become chapters of a book that I'm trying to write effectively. But they all, as I think I've said it several times, the language, they kind of hang on Pirsig's framework. So in the first book, and in fact in the on quality selections that Wendy published posthumously as well, the focus is very much on what Pirsig called quality or dynamic quality in Lila, which is that most of our understanding of the world really does come from our direct interaction with it.
And you said, however, in your the way you summed up this theory is you said the quality event is the atom of the fundamental atom of existence, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and I've tried to somehow fit that into a wider caucus of science and philosophy, what that means. That's if you like, my project. But that was undoubtedly right at the center of what he did, and Wendy reinforced that when she did the posthumous selection. What he did in Lila, again, still in a work of fiction, but with lots of his stories, technical stories woven into it, shout-outers as he called them. He did, in fact, I think he responded to a lot of the criticism from philosophy from his early work that there wasn't really an obvious visible metaphysics in it. In fact, he didn't coin the phrase the metaphysics of quality in the first book. It was just quality he was talking about. So I think he was obviously spurred on to try and produce a book where the metaphysics became something more technically described that you could, point to and talk about. And a lot of his readers in the sort of Lila squad and the early MOQ discuss stuff were about it, documenting exactly that. The place he actually documented in a picture first was in that subject, object, data and values paper that he presented at a conference in Holland. So it became more intellectual. It became more about actually having a symbolic model representing the thing that he was describing, rather than just his description in a textual document. And I would say actually the thing that's got me back into it was I got a bit bored with those arguments, which was like, you can have those arguments over and over again and you realize we're not really making any progress. There's just two different views here. It's a good thing that there's two different views. What we mustn't do is just keep beating each other up till we all agree on one view. So I got a bit bored with that. I say I moved off and just tried to put the same thinking into my own research and writing.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, sorry. But the reason I got back into it, which is why we're here talking now, was I actually think, again, I wouldn't have said it at the time, but now a couple of, nearly 2 years later, the fact that Wendy published that posthumous set of stuff with the focus very much back on the quality.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually had several conversations with Wendy since, because I've been working up to this idea of a Robert Pirsig Association. She is actually quite emphatic about this, about protecting Bob's legacy, that before people get into what he called philosophology, the idea of philosophers criticizing each other's work from a technical level, not to lose sight of the fact that it was about this quality experience of the world. So I took that on board, and I began to realize lots of stuff I've been doing had actually kind of been saying the same things in their own ways, whether it was sort of Whitehead and his process philosophy and the rather strange language he uses to describe it. But he didn't use the word quality, but he used the idea of a nexus, which was these points where the brain and the world, or the body and the world connect.
Makes sense.
So he didn't use the word event, he used the word nexus. And then, of course, you realise, Pirsig himself did actually acknowledge that he'd taken quite a lot of thinking, or paralleled a lot of his stuff with what William James had done as well.
Well, it's
so there are lots of connections.
The On Quality book really, it stands out, like the spiritual, if you want to call it that aspect of it, which I think it is a big part of it, and the way that the Zen meditation or the Zen practices are supposed to put you directly in contact with that primacy of reality. It really was emphasized in that book in a way that I hadn't seen in any other writings by or about Pirsig.
Yes, right. It obviously is mentioned in the early book, but in both books really, but more in the first book. But to pull just those examples into one collection, and of course the other really important thing was what Wendy and their older son Ted, younger son Ted, discovered was that they had this recording of Bob giving that presentation at the Minnesota School of Art, was it? Minneapolis School of Art.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
just a few weeks, I think it's about 5 or 6 weeks after the book was first published, and already he was becoming a bestseller and a bit famous and getting called for TV interviews and things. But he gave that talk to the local college. And again, Wendy's pointed that out to people. That's actually quite important because it was delivered so shortly after the book was published, the first book was published, emphasizing the quality. And the bit for me, actually, this is actually another whole topic for me, is he describes in there the whole creative process, not just the thinking about it, but the actual, how do you actually put a book with those sort of messages together with those sort of messages in it. And it's something I've picked up on before because, again, it sounds really arcane, but he started keeping these 3 by 5 inch slips of ideas. And some of the slips were ideas about what connected other ideas, but everything was basically on a slip. And I noticed this was very close to the sort of relational information modeling I've been doing professionally as a job, 10 years, 15 years earlier. And I thought, that's interesting. Yeah, so he was doing this on bits of cardboard, what we were trying to do inside computers. Which doesn't mean it's a mechanistic exercise, but in fact, if you watch that talk, he's very important about the fact that if you're trying to write a complicated document and you say get into a Word or some word processing sort of piece of software, publishing piece of software, and you start with an outline and then you elaborate. Once you get a bit into it and you've edited several things several times, the outline has really changed, but nobody ever goes back and kind of reorganizes the structure. He realized what he'd done by doing it on separate cards rather than one document was he could just reorganize the structure anytime he liked. And
right, and that is a really beautiful thing that he said. Is you take these, you put these important points on the slips, and then what comes first?
Yeah, and you can change your mind anytime you like until you're finished. That's right. Whereas if you have an outline, if you don't keep the outline up to date, you get stuck. And because I noticed that's in fact because when I started in sort of 2001, 2, before I read Pirsig, because I joined the blogging community, and blogging was in those days just about, well, people weren't writing long essays then because it wasn't really the space to do it, but it was just about blogging a thought with a link in it that linked it to another thought. It was quite the same thing, And so I've spotted quite a few writers using exactly that process before the internet was invented, and obviously since. It's a really good. So it's a really arcane, tiny little technical detail of how it was done, but it turns out to be a very creative way of doing it.
Well, it's as simple as can be, and yet it works so well because it underlies that process, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's a few things that you said about Pirsig's work in your paper, and I really liked the way you boiled it down. You boiled it down the same way he does, but you have your own take on it. You boil it down to quality, dynamism, and evolution. And I really like what you said about the most fundamental atoms in the world are interactions. And of course, I'm going to link to all these things so people can read the whole thing.
Yeah,
I just want to read this whole thing because it's great. When we look at the world, we needn't restrict ourselves to objective views, we must look for the quality of the relevant interactions.
Yes. Yeah. So
And then
was that?
If you,
where was that quote from?
On that's from, this is from the paper.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah,
not,
must be quite towards the end.
Yeah,
oh yes, that's right. I put a summary of those four paragraphs.
It's evolutionary psychology, stupid. It's from that part.
Yeah.
And it's toward the end where you're boiling down what you got.
Yes. They were my sort of takeaway points from Pirsig. I haven't developed any theses of my own, but I just ended up summarizing a few. That's right. I've got it now. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so do you want to talk a little bit about each one of these? Quality, which is the fundamental atom, and then you've got a PowerPoint that you did that let's see if I can.
Oh, an actual picture. Yeah. So in those days, immediately after the conference, and obviously preparing the paper for the conference, I was trying to produce, my own definitive version of what his metaphysics was as a picture, as people kind of do in the sort of intellectual world. You create diagrams of things that you're explaining. And
you put quality as the most fundamental atoms of stuff. The most fundamental atoms of stuff are interactions. Dynamism, the most fundamental worldview is a process view. And then evolution, the long run overview of the organization of all these static and dynamic things. So this just, right. It's what he said, but you summed it up in your own words in a way that's really accessible.
Yes, and I'm guessing I probably haven't annotated that since, because I think that still stands as a pretty good summary. That's right. Although the detail of what we mean by evolution and the detail of what we mean by processes and things evolve the closer you get to the foundations of physics. But still basically the framework on which I hang everything. And particularly also the evolutionary framework of his was, of course, again, it's been done different ways by different people, but he didn't build it. He built it around the quality. Is that you have these levels of evolution from physics to biology to the mental realm, and then you have within the mental realm this bit that takes you into a sort of social aspect of interactions of how you learn things from the world through other people, but also how you then symbolize it in intellect, so you can talk about it more formally. The whole MOQ discuss thing was very much talking about those two things. In fact, some famous, infamous disagreements in there about subject, object, language.
If you read Life as Child, you can, it's basically it's verbatim without some editing. But you can, you can see the arguments in there. It's kind of fun.
I say eventually I got bored. I think seems an odd word to use, but I still hugely improvised it. But I wasn't interested in having those arguments. I know it was just like, look, these are just two different views of the same thing. Whatever we do, we just need to not lose sight that there's these two different views. Oh, and of course, when you're in a sort of technical intellectual space, the bit that's easy to hold on to is the symbolic, in language, in symbols, in diagrams, in computer models. That's the easy bit. What you tend then is forget, but the bits that matter are the human interactions that created those atoms that you're building into this model. And so, in fact, dragging people into that humanistic, or you tend to avoid the word spiritualistic, just because it, as I say, it frightens the horses. If you try to have a conversation using the word spiritual when you're talking to a technical scientific geek, they just turn off and their eyes glaze over. But so it's more humanistic. It's going away from the technical to the human interaction aspects. But
so you were kind of, that describes you before Pirsig to some extent, right?
Yeah. I would never understood any of those words if you talked to me about that then. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But would you say that because these ideas were in a novel, it somehow got to a part of your brain, maybe, or maybe this is what it does for people, and then turned something around so that you had more access to that side of you, which we all have?
Absolutely, yeah. And I did write a couple of things about this at the time as well. Yes, I became this born-again reader, and I would never have analysed it where you just said it, but I'm sure what you said is absolutely right. It must have somehow connected with a different part of my brain that I hadn't used enough before, and somehow it added value that I didn't know it was possible to add. And absolutely. And therefore, as I say, I can find that same sort of philosophical content in any number of genres of fiction now, which I would never even bothered to look before.
Well, let me just as an aside, you said you went right to Dostoevsky from Pirsig.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about that.
Dostoevsky and in fact Tolstoy as well. Well, all of them really, but yeah. So um, with Dostoevsky, it was uh, yeah, Crime and Punishment. I guess was the one first where I realised that Razumikin and Raskolnikov, lots of those exchanges were very much about what was truth and what was madness. And of course, people tend to forget a lot of that is in Pirsig. I mean,
Yes.
That the world based on a sort of purely rational model was in fact going mad. It needed this balance of this quality view of everything as well as this strictly rational view, the Church of Reason, as he called it. But you find those same stories, and particularly, of course, in Tolstoy, Anna Karenina. The whole of the second half of Anna Karenina is Levin having this conversation with himself for and it's a big book, and it's about half the book is on that. People tend not to realize. But yes, everywhere now I find it. Obviously, modern authors like Salman Rushdie and people like this have lots of this in them as well. But again, as you said, it was touched a part of my brain I never really used before, and has since become a mind expanding in that sense, that I had all of this technical stuff. And of course, just doing this, of course, we're talking left-right brain stuff. So getting into the science of how human thought evolves and how the brain works the way it does, that's become an enormous part of my actual work now, which is why I kind of left Pirsig behind. That was like just the first step. But the more I do, the more I find it still hangs on the same framework. So a lot of my stuff has been in, consciousness studies and things like that.
Well, people are very interested in these things right now. What do you suppose that is?
Sorry, just phrase that again.
People are very interested in consciousness studies and the nature of reality. And that's becoming, I mean, it's not front and center in, the common media, but on the side with people like Don Hoffman and Bernardo Castro and people like that, there is a lot of that exploration. And it really seems to be catching on. What do you suppose is going on there?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite right, actually. I'm not an idealist or a panpsychist, but I am what I call a pan-proto-psychist, which is the stuff that makes up the stuff of the world is both psychic and physical, because it's, Pirsig called it quality, I just call it information, but it doesn't matter which it is, physics or psyche, they're both made of the same stuff. That doesn't mean to say it makes any sense to ask a question like, is an electron conscious? And that's the sort of part of the problem is once you get into this space, scientists start devising what turn out to be incredibly naive and silly questions. It's like, no, we're not talking about that. So just finding a way of having a conversation is quite hard work. So, why? Yeah, well, why is it happening? I think it is because, particularly with all the what's the buzzword? Polycrises, all the existential crises the world thinks it's facing at the moment. And we can have an argument about whether it's actually true or not, but certainly perception is we have a huge number of existential crises. And the fact that more people communicate. In fact, you asked me, we've got a question to come back to on that, which is really good. Yeah. So
segue to that.
The fact that we're communicating more with each other through social media and things like that, and just 24/7 news of every kind, on so many channels, so many social channels as well as media channels. Any impression that we get gets reinforced really fast as a sort of group thing, global group thing all the time. So you end up with people who are very much into one topic or very much against a topic, and everything gets polarized really, really fast. And the fact that it's more complicated than that, you just can't have that conversation. And so what? Yeah, so just to finish this question first. Yeah, so why? So I think more people are seeing there must be something more. We're missing something here. Science has made such huge advances, and we got all this technology just keeps getting better by the day. For some reason, the way we interact seems to be getting worse. And I think a lot of people say, we must be missing something. And I think that thing has put a lot of people who are thinking more philosophically about, well, where does this kind of meaning and trust and all these kind of things come from? They don't come from the technology, that's for sure. So because I'd been in technology a lot of my life before that, in terms of information modeling and systems, I was very interested in where this is going. And so all the work in the sort of AI space is interesting because it's actually people learning about how real brains work. It's not that they'll ever make an AI that works like a real brain. That's a much bigger project. But by trying and failing, they're learning a lot more about, the reason it fails is because it's not a human. But what is it about humans that makes them understand the world better than this piece of technology? So that's very interesting, So I'm very much in that space. Yeah.
It's kind of hard to, we're a continuum, right? And technology's pieces put together that looks like a continuum but isn't in a way. Is that something like that?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, we've been doing this gesture a while. Yeah, so there is definitely a continuum between the sort of highly formalized symbolic stuff and the purely experiential aesthetic stuff. And clearly there is a continuum here of things that are more one than the other, and it's very easy to draw hard and fast lines and say, no, we're on this side or that side. But in fact, almost every situation has some of both. You need to just be open to that. And I think more people are open to it now. I mean, the whole mindful movement and things like this, just that people just, even if it's just seen as a sort of taking a time out from the everyday world, people are realizing that there's other side of things. I personally don't do much of this. It's not me. I don't go on retreats and lock myself away and meditate for an hour every day. I don't, but I really understand why people do it, and I try to put little bits of it into my life, but I've never gone completely to that sort of side of it. But
can I read something that you said on Zen in your paper? It said, by breaking our comfort zone, what Zen does is remind us of the pitfalls in our established patterns of thinking and the linguistic traps in identifying and naming objects, which common sense and cultural history have made appear more concrete than perhaps they are. That kind of mirrors what we were just saying. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes. Very good. If I say so myself. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Full of gems like this. That's what makes it. I mean, parts of it are kind of challenging.
Part of the problem is I am kind of every which way at once because I've got like my own stuff. Stuff gets kind of lost a bit, and I need to nail down.
When you get to the part where you incorporate metaphysics of quality, it becomes an easy read and very very good way of using Pirsig in thought. So I'm going to ask my question now because I think it sort of is segued into there. So my question is, since you were able to turn your own professional and philosophical thinking around based on Pirsig's model, and on one thing you said about Pirsig's model, you said that when you discovered it, you said, I had found the best working model of the world which I could conceive. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, I've had that pointed out to me several times. I said that. Best is probably the wrong word. Yeah, absolutely. No, best is probably the wrong word. It just remains the most useful. You could obviously refine it as you learn more things in more context. You could change the words a bit and change the definitions of, but as something of that shape. I'm an architect as much as anything else, so I don't write code. When we talk about systems, I'm an architect, so I'm interested in the sort of topology, the general shape of things, which I lose a lot of friends sometimes in the real world by not caring about details that they care about. But it's a deliberate choice, which is, well, I know you care about those details, so I'm going to care about the higher sort of structure under which those details fit. So I'm very much interested in the topology of things, the way they're organized, rather than the details of what is organized. So that's the thing I found useful about Pirsig's thing was, even if you strip away all of the contentious words that people have said, no, he means this, no, he means that, what did he really mean here? And is there a better way of saying this or that? I think, well, forget all of that. But the shape, just the 4 layers and things like this, and the fact that what they represent in terms of patterns of static value, bits where we've actually captured a piece of what was once a piece of quality or a dynamic quality, but kind of captured it in a pattern that we've somehow documented or built into the way we think. That actually is kind of hard to beat, really.
Yeah, and you can't.
That's the one thing.
And you shouldn't forget the origin or the fact that it can change.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So
evolution's kind of built into the model, actually. Yes.
Right. Exactly. So, so I wrote quality seems to have been replaced with what's distracting and entertaining.
Yes, yes. Oh, yes, that's good. Actually, that joins up exactly to what I just.
This
Yeah,
last
finish. Go on. Yeah.
that last part of the
Yes.
question. How can individuals and mankind in general find quality appealing again so that we move forward desiring and doing what's good rather than what's reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so good and reasonable, that's another way of characterizing these two, you know, the symbolic reason versus the just experienced goodness of quality. Yeah. I picked up on your middle sentence there about distracting and entertaining. One of the concepts I've used all the way through my right since the beginning, because it was so shortly after 9/11, was this concept of a memetic problem, which is, so memes are the idea of bits of information that we share with each other in easy, snappy, easy to recall, easy to share ways. And that's what have become memes in terms of the things that most people call memes, these little pictures that ring a bell and people share instantly. But that principle, that little packets of information that are very easy to digest and very easy to share, become the bits of information that spread fastest. The subtle bits of information that say, well, hold on a minute, that picture here and this picture here are actually related in a bit more complicated way than just treating them as two different things. That message took me 20 words to say, so that message never gets beyond the first level of social media. So it's the little simple snippets that spread. And I recently picked up a word from Paula Wright that has christened that what I used to just call the memetic problem. She calls dysmemics, which is that, and I've used the word many times before, bad information spreads more easily and quickly than good information. It's just that's actually one of the things that, for me, that's almost what I'm fighting against, quite frankly. Whether you're inside science or just in general media, it's still absolutely what's going on.
Meaning that the bad information is too simplified. It doesn't contain enough of the whole to convey the
there's a strong, and of course there's a strong incentive to simplify. You know, people, when you're explaining things, there's an assumption that you will, you know, if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it, sort of thing. Well, that's fine at a level, but you have to remember, I only said it that way so that a 5-year-old could understand it. It doesn't tell you the whole story. If you want to know the whole story, come back and ask me again. You know, it's not like, but unfortunately, the first simple bit is the bit, you know, that gets out there. You know, as Churchill said, you know, lies get halfway around the world, you know, before the truth gets its pants on. You know, it's not a new concept. None of these are new concepts. It's in fact in the Greeks, in fact, but it very much is what's happening, and it's, I guess, the significance now of why is it changed and what's happening now is, of course, you know, the internet. It's the fact that communication is so ubiquitous and fast now means that getting a grip on what is quality information is very, very hard. Because it's the easy information that spreads fastest.
But do you have an idea of what might be compelling to people who are kind of brainwashed in this direction these days? I mean, with reduced attention spans, with ideas that these very simple ideas are reality. I mean, I know that's a tough question. We're all thinking about this, but what's your take on
it? It's unfortunately an idea that probably hasn't got any mileage, but I've been saying this because, of course, I got into this because of the power of the internet to actually discover and connect up information. And I spotted it very early. So I've been calling it this. It's probably actually might even be in that 2005 paper. I don't know. But the idea, of memetic evolution of information in the media space. What I've been saying for a long time is essentially what we need is moderation. So if you had a proper discussion forum like MOQ did for a while, it had MOQ Discuss, but it also had MOQ Forum. This is actually quite interesting. I think there's some lessons in this. MOQ Discuss was only moderated insofar as you just couldn't be rude to each other, basically. You know, as long as you tried to answer the question and didn't sort of get into ad hominem fights with people, you were okay. But of course, what that meant was in the discussion forum, every topic under the sun connected to every other topic under the sun was being discussed at the same time, and no conversation ever ended. Yeah. In the forum area rather than discuss area, Horse actually set it up so it was moderated on a proper time dimension, which was someone put forward some idea. It might be a paper or an essay that they'd written, and say, there's some ideas in this worth discussing. And then that would be the topic of conversation for at least 2 weeks.
Mm.
You couldn't say, oh, here's an interesting thing I've just found from the internet, and stick it in the middle of the conversation. You had no. And obviously, if the conversation ended after 2 or 3 days, it ended after 2 or 3 days. But if it took 2 weeks, it took 2 weeks. At least you then all have, you're forced to concentrate on that one conversation. Now, in fact, there are media now, like Discord and one or two others, that actually are set up that you can do this as well. But to be, credit to Horse, when he set up that forum, he knew what he was doing. Of course, what happens now is that just never happens. So I use the word moderation, which was the same word that people use when they were just, moderating, comment chains on the end of media pieces and so on. And of course, it's in social media itself now. But again, the problem is you can never fully objectify all of those rules. You can't have X or Twitter stroke X are never going to have a set of rules that automatically moderates things for all the right reasons. They'll have a few reasons they can moderate and a few they can't. When I say moderate, I mean slow it down.
Right.
So I'm not censoring anybody. I'm not saying you can't say that, but could you just hold on to saying it until the appropriate moment, and then you can say it. So I use the word moderation in exactly the same way it works in a nuclear reactor, which is you put the carbon rods in and out to slow down the neutrons and how fast they move between things. He said, whoa, slow down a bit. You can take the moderator out, you have a nuclear explosion. So I use it that way. And again, I've tried to use that metaphor to get people to understand it. But basically, when I say moderation, I mean, can we just slow down the conversation? If I keep using the word proper dialogue, one of the things we just don't have enough of. We have lots of exchanges of information, but is it ever proper dialogue? Oh, it's few and far between, unless you actually get into a session where you set yourselves up like you've done here, or you have an area inside the social media where you control what's actually happening. Very few people do it. It's always, here's another interesting thing. That's what you use the word distraction. Distraction and here's an interesting thing. Here's an interesting thing. It's like, yeah, we know that. Go away. We're having a conversation.
Yeah, that's the tsunami of snippets, right? So let me segue into the next question, because it's very related. So what do you see as a quality relationship with technology for the average user? There's so many complaints about this, about people being immersed in this virtual world. And as you said, here's the new thing. But we're here, we're here in this virtual world. It's here to stay. So what's a good way of balancing ourselves and technology? And by technology, I mean, for the average person, which is pretty much going to be the internet and related tools such as AI and things coming down the road that we really have to be concerned with, or that I think we need to be concerned with, but maybe you're less concerned. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any magic bullet. I mean, it's recommendations based on, really, as you say, it segues into what we've just been saying. So I just think it's actually it's the people we have to remind about. It's not about the technology. The technology can do any of the things we want it to do. So it's really about educating the humans, which is to set aside time for different ways of doing things, really. There are times when instant updates of technical content is very important to what you're doing, but there are times when it's not. It's more important that you value the human input to that thing that came to you, and maybe that involves having an extra conversation with that person rather than just taking at face value their last tweet or something. So I think it's more about, which is why it's back to Pirsig. It's about emphasizing that humans need to think about quality of their interactions with the world, and their interactions with media are not their highest quality interactions with the world. I actually, I have no magic bullet, but I say I have my own project and writing project, and it's in 2 parts, well, 3 parts, I guess. One part is a kind of technical description of what we've been talking about, so I can explain it to more, other intelligent people. Right? Does this make sense? Am I saying stuff that makes sense? But in fact, the output for the thing that I'm calling my thesis is, let's get the right word, systems thinking ecosystem. So I've used the label systems thinking for most of the stuff I use in this technical space, where what you're really thinking about is not the things, but the systematic relationships or the functional relationships between things. So put the focus back on the functional relationships from the entities. I tend to think in the wider world, that's just systems thinking. So I've put systems thinking in front. But what I've done is put this word environment at the end of it, which is obviously very fashionable these days for just about every platform or tool. People use the word environment, but we have to actually educate, breed an environment where we actually more naturally think like this, so that we're not instantly drawn to the fastest way of answering every question, because it's unlikely to be the best. And this is actually a piece of work I haven't written yet. I'm just working up to it. But I think we need this. So, for instance, things like critical thinking became very popular, as everybody must be educated in critical thinking. It makes them more discerning and things like this. It's part of it, but it's very much focused on the intellectual end of this, critical thinking of intellectual stuff. And similarly with things like woke, this idea that people can suddenly get, they see an issue which they recognize important. Good, tick, you recognize that's important. But what do we do next? Isn't your first knee-jerk response to what that thing said. It's connected to lots of other things in the world, and the reason I mentioned those two things is I think very much getting to education about the ways things are taught, and I think there needs to be a teaching of how we actually make this mental space to have more than one way of thinking that includes this end of it. So I call it a systems thinking ecosystem, but I could call it a quality system, a quality thinking ecosystem. But I tend to change the words because part of the problem I'm having here, this is why I say for about 4 or 5 years, I actually completely stopped using any of Pirsig's terminology. It was behind me, as it were. But you're talking to people who are technocrats of various sorts, whether they're scientists or systems people or whatever they are, and even people in sort of governance these days, in government, everything has to be sort of justified on a cost-effective, objective basis. All this kind of stuff is just it's in every part of the way we work now. It's not. It's just saying no, but we have to make space for this other kind of thinking.
We have to make space for the good, not just the reasonable.
Yeah, it's lots of ways of summarizing. Absolutely, it's just, yeah, absolutely.
Makes sense. So the last part I'd like to talk about is so we have this great anniversary coming up, and you're really involved in the Robert Pirsig Association. Yeah. So tell me what your hopes are for this anniversary, and how people could get involved, and what you're looking for from other people who want to get involved.
Yeah. Okay, so declaration of interest here first. I actually am not keen on planning by the sun and the moon. So I don't think dates matter very much. The fact that it's 50 years since he'd written it doesn't change anything about the quality of it. But it's good to have something, an excuse. It's just an excuse to hang stuff on. Right? There's nothing special about the 50th year.
An excuse to start thinking Pirsig again, and bringing.
If we're on a different planet, the sun would be going around the sun at a different speed. It's just So having put that aside, for me, the 50th anniversary is just an excuse. It's a reason to say let's use this as a bit of impetus to pull this stuff together in a. So my real interest is the permanent outcome of this, which is let's have the Pirsig story documented in a sustainable way, which covers everything it needs to cover, does it in a fairly consistent way so people can navigate and search and find what they need and all that kind of thing, and hopefully have a space with this kind of environment which has been talking about. Maybe the sad news is that both Ant and Horse have kind of dropped out of the proceedings recently, but we can still reinvent what they were trying to do. And I say credit to Horse, he did get that thing right about the MOQ.org. So one of my things is that once we've got it as a sort of website, which everything is these days, with some structure as to how we organize it, who's responsible for managing what underneath it, I think I do want an interactive space in there as well. It won't just be social media, it won't just be email, it won't just be that kind of thing, but it would be something that's moderated to make sure it is part of that more balanced space. It's not just moderated on the technical level. It's moderated on, leaving space for these things. So I'm not sure how much you picked up. Yeah, so you weren't at the last meeting, but you saw the notes, didn't you? Yeah. So we've got this young guy in Canada who looks quite keen to do something with technology that he's using to help us build this environment. So at the moment, it's a very flat website that I just knocked up one Sunday afternoon.
It's still looking pretty good, though. I mean, it's looking the best it's had in a long time. So
it's looking good. I mean, the problem is it's very thin. So when you go down, there's lots of lists of things with no links in them and things like that. So it's all ready to be filled in and stuff. And I've drawn a picture I haven't shared with people yet of how I think the content gets organized underneath it. But we'll share that at the next meeting. But yeah, so my focus is on the permanent, sustainable, because my site's a hobby site effectively. If I run out of money or I die, then my site falls over. So we're trying to get something set up with a sustainable organization and a life beyond any one person's hobby.
Yeah, so it doesn't go by the wayside like it did last time. So it's still there as a resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So now I'm using the Pirsig.org domain, which was in fact Anthony's domain. Had somebody set up his site there. So I realized by using it, I've blown all of that stuff away, but it's all there in the Wayback Machine. We've been dragging all the archives off. In fact, that's where I started with Ant in these last 3 or 4 years. No, maybe more than that now, 5 or 6 years. He realized he'd lost control of his own website. Whoever he'd been using to run it for him had sort of fallen by the wayside. He was left. He didn't know anything. He doesn't do anything on the web. He's the content person. So I spent the first few years just recovering various addresses. He had the Pirsig.org and he had moquniversity.org and one or two others that he'd been setting up to actually put education on the web about it. So that's how I got into that. So I ended up owning about 6 different websites with Pirsig things just because nobody had bothered to, so I just bought them up so at least I could control them. I say the saddest thing in all of this is that neither Ant nor Horse are actually active in it. And I don't really know why yet, but because Horse was quite involved in some of the preliminary stuff, setting this up. But anyway, there's more than one of us, so we'll find a way of making it work.
And it's good you've done all that work. So really, I didn't realize that you were the one who were making all these, the reason that we can even find these sites at all is because of you. So I really appreciate that. Yeah,
I mean, obviously Henry's site has lots of stuff on, but Henry's site is the polite word I think me and David use. It's a bit sprawling. It's a very flat site with just loads of stuff stuffed on huge pages. So just navigating and finding stuff is hard work, but there's lots of good stuff there. But so we've been just gradually dragging stuff out and putting.
David, by the way, is the person behind ZMM Quality
on Facebook,
Facebook and on Twitter. And
it's on Twitter as well, yeah. So I guess most interaction on Facebook, and it was David just taking a lot of the content of Henry's site and finding a way of just putting it out into the world in a more user-friendly way, more graphic as well. Lots of pictures of people and places in it. So,
yeah, and
it's fantastic.
It is. It's very nice. Every few days he posts some kind of snippet that relates back to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, whether it's
and it's mostly historical stuff about people and places and stuff like that, which is great. In fact, this is part of the picture I'm talking. We've got a sort of picture of how we think the whole of this stuff is going to look when we actually get it organised. But so the whole people, places, biography, events kind of thing is one whole thing. That's about generating interest, maintaining interest.
And he does a great job.
And then we just need to feed them into, well, if you're interested in motorbikes, go over here. If you're interested in American geography, go over here. If you're actually interested in philosophy, come over here. So.
Well, I'm looking forward to going. I hope I'll have to learn a little bit more about it. But at the American History Museum on the 15th, they're going to have a event or they're going to open a show. So I can definitely go to that since I live in
Washington. Yes, you're in Washington, aren't you? Yes, that's right. Smithsonian, yeah.
So I'll be able to record that. So that's one thing I can do. Well,
yes, I'm not sure whether the actual opening of the display is itself a big event. I think it's being set up. They've got a lot of stuff in the, obviously in the basement, like every museum does, and they're creating an exhibition piece.
Well, what I need to do is call them and find out what actually is going on, so I can record something that is meaningful in some kind of way. I mean, at the very least, I can share things about the exhibition. But if there is any kind of event, I'd certainly like to be there.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, they're hoping to relate something to the Zen Ride is becoming the main focal event, with possibly events at both ends. But,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. In Minneapolis and in California.
well, when I say both ends, it might be Minneapolis and Bozeman.
Oh,
How many
yeah.
people choose to go the entire route? It's quite an undertaking to think about organising that for many people.
Oh, sure.
But yeah,
Minneapolis to Bozeman could be, that seems doable to
yeah,
some extent,
yeah,
even if
yeah.
it's sort
But
of,
obviously, nothing to stop people, making their own way to see all of it.
well, it's going to be interesting what happens. I mean, that would be starting in July, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah, 8th of July. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, Ian, it's been great. It's been great talking to you. Is there anything else we want to touch on before we end?
No, I think we covered everything.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I'll put all the links below and just hold on. I'll stop recording, but hold on just a second after I stop recording. And okay, so I really appreciate it. You're the man you're one of the main men who's making it happen, and it's great.
Yeah.
And I've really
It's
enjoyed
funny
talking.
after the Liverpool conference,
Yeah.
I posted a few pictures before they were up on Ant or Horses sites because I just happened to be there. And I was traveling, so I was only there for like 1.5 days, and I just uploaded my photographs as soon as I had them, which was a manual job in those days, of course.
Yes.
And somebody said almost exactly what you just said, "Oh, you must be a real celebrity in this space," and I think that is the worst word you could have used because, of course, it's completely contrary to what Pirsig's about. It's like,
Exactly.
you do the work, but you don't. Credit's okay, but none of us have to become superstars in this space where it becomes kind of cultish sort of thing.
Well, we can still be grateful to you, which I am. And thanks so much for
All right.
talking to me.
Thank you.
And so I will see you next time.